My name is Elish Sharabi. I am 53 years old. I've come back from hell.
The United States commends Elish Sharabi for his courage and for joining us today to provide searing, first-hand testimony to the depravity of Hamas. Thank you, Eli.
Netanyahu truly cared about the hostages, he would not have shattered the ceasefire that was allowing for their release. If anyone needed more evidence that Netanyahu could care less about the fate of the hostages, his decision to resume attacks against Gaza is the ultimate proof.
Elish Sharabi testified before you today and laid bare the horrors of his captivity. He described the torment he endured and spoke for the other hostages still in Hamas's hands. Now the question that demands an answer is this: where is the world? Where is your outrage?
My name is Elish Sharabi. I am 53 years old. I've come back from hell. I've returned to tell my story. I used to live in Kibbutz Be'eri with my British-born wife, Liane, and my daughters, Noya and Yahel. It was a beautiful community. We were all passionate about creating the best life for our children and for our neighbors. At 16, I left Tel Aviv for Be'eri, seeking a peaceful home, away from the concrete city. I found a loving community and knew I would raise my family there. Many asked why we lived near Gaza, but to me, Be'eri was heaven. Liane came from Bristol, UK, as a volunteer. She was meant to stay a few months, but she met me and we fell in love. We were married for 23 years and had 2 wonderful daughters and a dog, Mocha. On October 7, my heaven turned to hell. Sirens began. Hamas terrorists invaded, and I was ripped away from my family, never to see them again. For 491 days, I was kept mostly underground in Hamas terror tunnels, chained, starved, beaten, and humiliated. I was held captive in the darkness, isolated from the world by Hamas terrorists. They took pleasure in our suffering. I survived on scraps of food with no medical attention and no mercy. When I was released, I weighed just 44 kilos. I had lost over 30 kilos, nearly half my body weight. For 491 days, I held on to hope. I imagined the life we would rebuild. I dreamed of seeing my family again. Only when I returned home, I learned the truth. My wife and my daughters had been slaughtered by Hamas terrorists on October 7. I'm here today, less than 6 weeks ago after my release, to speak for those still trapped in that nightmare. For my brother Yossi, murdered in Hamas captivity, his body still held hostage. For Alon Oel, still 50 meters underground, I swore to him that I would tell his story. For Hirsch, Ori, Eden, Carmel, Almog and Alexander, murdered in cold blood by their captors. for every hostage still in Hamas' hands. I'm here to tell you the whole truth. On the morning of October 7, at 6:29 a.m., the red alerts began to come through on Lian's phone. I told her not to worry. It will be over soon, I said. Minutes later, we heard that terrorists were infiltrating our community. They were inside the kibbutz. Again, I reassured her, the army will come. They always come. We heard gunfire, screaming, explosions, and then we heard the terrorists at our door. We had no weapons, no way to fight back. Lian and I made a decision we would not resist. We hoped we could save our daughter. The door opened, our dog barked, the terrorist opened fire. Lian and I threw ourselves over our daughters, screaming for the terrorists to stop. Suddenly, 10 terrorists were inside my home. They took our phones. 2 of them grabbed me. They took my wife and daughters to the kitchen. I couldn't see them anymore. I didn't know what was happening to them. I was screaming their names, and they were screaming mine. I told Lian not to be afraid, but this was fear beyond anything I've ever felt. Then I knew I was being taken. As they dragged me out, I called out to my girls, I will be back. I had to believe that. But that was the last time I ever saw them. I didn't know I should have said goodbye forever. Outside was like a war zone. My peaceful home, my slice of heaven, was gone. I saw over 100 terrorists filming themselves, celebrating, laughing, partying in our gardens as they massacred my friends and neighbors. They dragged me out. They dragged me to the border, beating me the whole way. My face was swollen, my ribs bruised. When we arrived in Gaza, a mob of civilians trying to lynch me. They pulled me from the car, but the terrorists rushed me away into a mosque. I was their trophy. I thought about Lian, Noya, and Yael. Were they still alive? For the first 52 days, I was held in an apartment. I was tied up with ropes. My arms and legs were tied so tightly, the ropes tore into my flesh. I was given almost no food, no water, and I couldn't sleep. The pain was unbearable. Sometimes I would just faint from the pain, only to wake up to that pain again and again. Then, on November 27, 2023, Hamas took me into a tunnel, 50 meters underground. Again, the chains were so tight, they ripped my skin. They never took them off, not for a single moment. Those chains tore at me until the day I was released. Every step I took was no more than 10 centimeters. Every walk to the bathroom took an eternity. I cannot begin to describe the agony. It was hell. I was fed a piece of pita a day, maybe a sip of tea. Hunger consumed everything. They beat me. They broke my ribs. I didn't care. I just wanted a piece of bread. There was never enough food. Sometimes, if we begged enough, we would get something extra. We had to choose an extra piece of pita or a cup of tea. Sometimes they threw us dry dates, and it felt like the greatest gift in the world. We had to beg for food, beg to use the bathroom. Begging was our existence. We strategized over every meal. One day, I cut myself with a razor, just to make them believe I was injured. I collapsed on my way to the bathroom so they would think I was too weak and encourage them to give us more food. It worked. They gave us more food. We survived of those small victories. Do you know what it means to open a refrigerator? It is everything. To be able to reach and take a piece of fruit, an egg, a piece of bread. I dreamt of this simple act every day. For months, we lived like this. I stopped counting the days. Living as a hostage, you don't know how the day will begin, nor how it will end. Whether you live or die. At any moment, they could beat you. At any moment, they could kill you. You wake up every day and do not know when you will be able to eat. It could be 12 p.m., 5 p.m., 11 p.m. This would be the only meal we would have. You hope and pray that there will be no surprises with the captors. You think about how desperately you want to shower. We only got one bath a month with half a bucket of cold water. Toothpaste, toilet paper, forget it. Psychological terror was constant. Every day they told us, the world has abandoned you. No one is coming. By the time I met Alon Oel, who is now 24 years old, we had already endured terrible captivity. We relied on each other for survival. Alon is a very talented pianist, and I remember how he would pretend to play the piano on his body to keep himself sane. He doesn't look like anymore like that. One day, a terrorist took his anger out on me. He stormed in and beat me so badly that he broke my ribs. I couldn't properly breathe for a month. Alon tried to protect me with his own body. You couldn't believe how lucky I felt when Alon told me he had saved one painkiller pill. He gave it to me to get through the night. Alon still has a shrapnel in his right eye from the day he was kidnapped. He never received medical care. He never saw the Red Cross. To this day, he is blind in that eye. When I was released, he grabbed onto me, terrified to be left behind. He told me he was happy for me. I promised him it was just a matter of days before we would be home too. I was wrong. Just before my release, Hamas took pleasure in showing me a picture of my brother Yossi. This is my oldest brother, husband for Nira, a father for Yuval, Ophir, and Oren. They told me he was dead. It was like they had brought a massive hammer down on me. I refused to believe it. My brother Yossi was all heart. Those with him in captivity told me that he gave his food to others. On February 8, 2025, I was released. I weighed 44 kilograms. This is less than the body weight of my youngest daughter, Yahel. May her memory be blessing. I was a shell of my former self. I still am. I couldn't believe how I looked. I stood at that sick Hamas ceremony, surrounded by terrorists and a crowd of so-called uninvolved civilians, hoping my wife and daughters were waiting for me. At the handover, I met a representative from the Red Cross. She told me, "Don't worry, you are safe now." Safe? How could I feel safe surrounded by terrorist monsters? Where had the Red Cross been for the past 491 days? Then I arrived home. They told me my mother and sister were waiting for me. I said, "Get me my wife and daughters." And that was when I knew. They were gone. They had been murdered. I'm here today because I survived and I prevailed. But that is not enough. Not when Alon Hoel is still there. Not when 59 hostages are still there. Right now, Alon is trapped underground, alone, surrounded by terrorists who torment him. He doesn't know if he will ever see his mother, father, his entire beloved family again. I will not leave him behind. I will not leave anyone behind. Their time has almost run out. I'm here before you now to give my testimony and to ask, where was the United Nations? Where was the Red Cross? Where was the world? I know that you discussed the humanitarian situation in Gaza very often. But let me tell you, as an eyewitness, I saw what happened to that aid. Hamas stole it. I saw Hamas terrorists carrying boxes with the UN and UNRWA emblems on them into the tunnel. Dozens and dozens of boxes, paid by your government. Feeding terrorists who tortured me and murdered my family. They would eat many meals a day from the UN aid in front of us, and we never received any of it. When you speak of humanitarian aid, remember this. Hamas eats like kings, while hostages starve. Hamas steals from civilians. Hamas blocks aid from reaching those who truly need it. 491 days. That is how long I starved. How long I was chained. How long I begged for humanity. And in all that time, no one came. And no one in Gaza helped me. No one. The civilians in Gaza saw us suffering. They cheered our kidnappers. They were definitely involved. I was freed less than 6 weeks ago. I met President Trump at the White House and thanked him for securing my release and many others. I appreciate his efforts to free those still held hostage by Hamas. I told him, bring them all home. I met with Prime Minister Starmer at 10 Downing Street. I told him, bring them all home. Now, I'm here before you at the United Nations to say, bring them all home. No more excuses. No more delays. If you stand for humanity, prove it. Bring them home. My name is Elish Sharabi. I am not a diplomat. I am a survivor. Bring them all home. Now. Thank you.
Give the floor to the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine.
Madam President, allow me at the outset to thank Assistant Secretary General Khalid Khiyari for his briefing and to convey through him our condolences and solidarity for the UN staff members killed and injured, some sustaining life-altering injuries and amputation, while they were in UN premises as a result of Israeli bombardment yesterday, and others who were killed recently from UNRWA, as Mr. Lazzarini has informed us. These victims were upholding the UN's most noble mission, trying to save lives. And as all humanitarians, they are having to do so at the peril of their lives. They were upholding the mandate conferred to them by this Council in its resolution 2720. They are entitled to protection as Palestinian civilians are entitled to protection, and both are being blatantly deprived of it. This demonstrates yet again the indiscriminate nature of Israeli attacks. Allow me also to acknowledge the testimony of Elish Sharabi and present our condolences for his loss. Maybe no one around this table can fully grasp what such a loss means: the killing of loved ones, prolonged captivity, fear and trauma. But Palestinians, us, can. We understand this pain because we live it. They endure it every day. Entire families obliterated in massive and indiscriminate bombardments. Children shot by Israeli snipers in the head and in the chest. Communities uprooted by force. There is not a single Palestinian family that does not have a loved one killed, wounded, detained, or displaced. And they have been enduring these horrors and injustices for decades, even though they reached an unprecedented scale in the last year and a half. When confronted with such loss, either we pursue justice or vengeance. Justice ends suffering. Vengeance perpetuates it. Madam President, we will not accept incitement against Palestinian civilians. We will not accept excuses for their killing and maiming and torture. We will not accept justification for collective punishment. We saw Israelis calling for and cheering on genocide. We saw Israelis signing bombs to be dropped on the heads of Palestinian families. We saw Israelis block humanitarian aid to a starving population. We saw Israelis attack innocent Palestinians. But we do not attribute these acts generically to Israeli civilians, nor do we use these actions as justification for indiscriminate killing and maiming and for dehumanizing and punishing millions of people. We have a right to life too, a right to liberty and dignity, a right to live in peace in our ancestral land. Till when will our people have to suffer from the inability to see Palestinians as equals, to acknowledge their suffering and their loss, to remember that around 1 million Palestinians have experienced captivity, that many died while in Israeli jails, killed or left to die? Not a single Palestinian family did not have a Palestinian that visited Israeli jails. Not a single Palestinian family. Israel arrests our children, our doctors, our teachers, our workers, family members, bystanders, parliamentarians, academics, human rights defenders. Israel considers all Palestinians guilty. All Palestinians guilty. Till when will people pretend they do not see the images of Palestinians coming out of Israeli captivity looking like ghosts, starved and traumatized, beaten and some raped? Till when Israel will pretend it bears no responsibility in the crimes it commits? Till when our humanity and our rights will be denied? We have to note that usually the ones who suffered most on both sides have been among the most passionate advocates for a ceasefire for over a year now. Those who suffer the most, they have solidarity with each other. Their calls should be heeded, as many of you referred to another victim that gave testimony to us, and she asked for the ceasefire to be defended and the 3 stages of the agreement to be implemented. Listen to her. Their calls should be heeded. Their suffering should not be used to inflict more death and devastation or as an excuse for perpetual war, genocide, forced displacement and annexation, dehumanization and hate. The suffering of all civilians must end. All civilians. We have a duty to end the occupation and conflict and to ensure life prevails, to ensure liberty prevails, to ensure shared peace and security prevail, if we truly care about the victims and about our peoples. Madam President, in 42 days, many more hostages were released than in 15 months of indiscriminate bombardments. If Netanyahu truly cared about the hostages, he would not have shattered the ceasefire that was allowing for their release. If anyone needed more evidence that Netanyahu could care less about the fate of the hostages, his decision to resume attacks against Gaza is the ultimate proof. All Israel had to do was move forward in implementing the ceasefire. Everyone knows this truth, starting with the families of the hostages themselves, who are still demonstrating to stop the bloodshed and restore the ceasefire. Killing innocent Palestinian civilians by the hundreds each day, forcibly displacing our population with the clear aim of annexing our land and ending our national identity has nothing to do with hostages or security. It has everything to do with the attempt to destroy the Palestinian people as the means to seize their land. Madam President, the Israeli Minister of War addressed what he called the residents of Gaza, saying, and I quote, "Soon the evacuation of the population from combat zones will resume, and what follows will be far more severe. You will pay the full price, return the hostages and remove Hamas. The alternative is total devastation." End of quotation. After having confessed to weaponizing humanitarian aid, Israel is also confessing to its policy of collective punishment, indiscriminate attacks, and of wanton destruction and devastation. The Israeli government cannot speak of humanity nor denounce barbarism, not when it kills 400 Palestinians in one night, including over 150 children, representing one of the largest single-day child death toll in the last year. Not when it killed 50,000 Palestinians, maimed over 100,000 Palestinians, and destroyed the lives of 2 million people. Not when it is starving our people. Not when it is forcibly displacing them. Not when it is abducting thousands and subjugating them to torture and beating and degrading treatment and sexual violence. Not when it is detaining the corpses of hundreds of Palestinians, denying their families the right to provide their loved ones dignified burial. Israel considered it is barbarism only if it attributes to the act of Hamas, but it is justified if it is committed by Israel. It is barbarism if the act is against an Israeli, and it is legitimate if the act is against a Palestinian. Look at this, despicable, double standard. Israel has a right to kill and maim, to arbitrarily detain and torture, to displace and destroy and devastate, and we have the right to die and disappear. That is not how international law works. There are prohibited actions regardless of the identity of the perpetrators and regardless of the identity of the victims. There are protections afforded to all civilians regardless of the nationality, religion, and race. These prohibitions and protections must be upheld. Madam President, civilians should not be harmed. Civilians should not be harmed. They should not fear being killed in their houses or abducted from their homes. Families should not be torn apart. They should be reunited in life, not in death. Reunited in life, not in death. We have been pushing for a ceasefire that guarantees this aim, while Israel continues advocating for more killing and more destruction. There is no military solution to this conflict. You cannot kill your way to a solution. You cannot negate the millions of Palestinians. We are rooted as olive trees deep in our land. You cannot kill all of us. Again, there is no military solution to this conflict, and you cannot kill your way to a solution. The Israeli government is trying to convince its people that killing, dispossession, and displacing Palestinians is the only way forward, while we have, even in the midst of this genocide, continued to plead for achieving our freedom through peaceful means. Our president from this chamber said, "I am ready to negotiate and to talk peace." And for those who said, Ramallah is so close to Jerusalem. He is ready in Jerusalem and in Ramallah and everywhere to talk peace for those who are ready and willing. Palestinians is the only way forward, while we have, even in the midst, as I said, of this genocide, continued to plead for achieving our freedom through peaceful means, for respect for international law, for two states living side by side, as many of you state very often, for shared peace and security. It is for every government around the world to choose now the vision they will rally behind and to use all means available to them to see it prevails. Both sidism and balancing acts will not cut it. You have to decide. You cannot play both ways. The fate of millions of people cannot be left to the decisions of this Israeli government that caters far more to the political survival of Netanyahu than the survival of hostages, that wants to get rid of the Palestinian people and steal Palestinian land, that wants to render occupation permanent and peace impossible. The ceasefire is a test. Failing at it means only prolonging the agony and suffering caused by today's horrors, but setting the stage for horrors to come. It is a test we cannot afford to fail. We have to defeat this option. Peace is the only option available to us, to them, and to all of you. Help us to move in the direction of peace and away from the direction of killing and war. And I thank you very much, Madam President.
I thank the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Israel.
Thank you, Madam President, and thank you to Assistant Secretary General Chiari for your briefing today. I would like to thank the United States, the UK, and France for calling this important session. Before I begin, I want to thank Elish Sharabi for his courage today. Eli, there are no words that can begin to describe the strength it takes to be here after everything you have endured. None of us can truly comprehend the pain, the suffering, the loss you have endured. The torment of 491 days in captivity, the terror of returning to a home that no longer exists, the weight of knowing that your entire world was taken from you. Yet, despite all of this, you sit here today, not for yourself, but for those who remain behind. For over 530 days, 59 innocent men, women, and children have been trapped in Hamas captivity. Many of them are barely holding on to life. Unfortunately, some of them have been murdered, and Hamas has not let the world see a single one of them. These are innocent people being tortured for the crime of being Israelis or being in Israel. They are starving in the dark, alone, afraid, suffering beyond what words can capture. They are denied food, water, and medicine. They are beaten, tortured, and humiliated. They are being held in conditions so inhuman, so depraved, that the hostages who were freed can barely describe what they endured. The cruelty here is not just from Hamas. It is also from the silence of the world. Elish Sharabi testified before you today and laid bare the horrors of his captivity. He described the torment he endured and spoke for the other hostages still in Hamas's hands. Now the question that demands an answer is this: where is the world? Where is your outrage? Where is the international outcry for their release? Where is the demand from every nation to bring them home? Since October 7th, you have passed 77 resolutions in this chamber. There has not been a single resolution condemning Hamas. Meanwhile, there are those in this chamber who refuse to even mention the hostages. Algeria, you have spent months in this room condemning, accusing, and criticizing Israel. But when a human being sits before you today, after enduring the worst of humanity at the hand of those you defend, you could barely acknowledge his presence. You couldn't find the decency to even say his name. That is outrageous. And the world can see it. For 530 days, you have erased the hostages. You have spoken about Gaza without mentioning the crimes of Hamas. You have debated humanitarian assistance without acknowledging the humanitarian crimes Hamas is deliberately inflicting on the hostages. You have had the audacity to talk about a ceasefire without demanding that those held in Hamas's terror tunnels be freed. How can you claim to stand for international law while ignoring the hostages? How can you speak of human rights when you refuse to recognize the most horrific human rights abuse in this war? How can you sit in this chamber, look Elish Sharabi in the eye, and say nothing? The massive amounts of humanitarian aid that Israel has facilitated, coordinated, and allowed into Gaza have reached every segment of the population except one: the hostages. While Gazan civilians benefit from food, medicine, shelter, and support, these innocent individuals languish in conditions that defy human comprehension. Those hostages have not seen an ounce of that aid. Think how many trucks, how many containers. We listened to you, Eli, that you got a quarter of a pita a day. There are so many on this council, you, who never fail to scream for more aid, more trucks, more shipments, more access, yet you have never once demanded that a single piece of that aid be delivered to our hostages. Not a single word has been spoken. Not a single demand has been made. Not a single resolution has been passed insisting that those in the most desperate need of humanitarian assistance actually receive it. The UN's inaction on the plight of the hostages is a moral collapse of the highest order. To be clear, it's not just this council that has failed. The entire UN system has forsaken its responsibility. So many agencies that claim to be the protectors of humanity have abandoned the hostages entirely. Where was the Security Council? The General Assembly? OCHA? UNICEF? The so-called Human Rights Council? The Red Cross? The Red Cross has not conducted one visit, one inspection. We heard the absurd equation you made about the detainees in Israel. They have 3 meals a day, they have medical treatment, they have visitations of the Red Cross. Before the war, they had visitations of families. How can you compare it? The Red Cross had no one inspection or spent one moment with the hostages in Gaza. And yet, for 530 days, the Red Cross has continued to act according to Hamas's playbook. Colleagues, there is one absolute certainty in this situation. The war will not end until the hostages are freed. Israel did not choose this war. Hamas did. It was Hamas that invaded Israel and Eli's home. It was Hamas that slaughtered our people, and for 3 months it was Hamas who stalled negotiations. Hamas was given the chance to extend the ceasefire. Hamas was given the opportunity to bring relief to the people of Gaza. Hamas was given a choice, and they chose war. Therefore, Israel has resumed its military operations against Hamas with increasing force. The IDF is striking Hamas terror targets throughout the Gaza Strip. Terrorist infrastructure, weapons stockpiles, and command centers are being dismantled. This will continue. This will continue until every last hostage is home. This war does not end with hostages left underground. This war does not end until Hamas is defeated. The choice is simple. If you want a ceasefire, then pressure Hamas to release the hostages immediately. Madam President, Elish Sharabi should not have to be here today. He should have never been taken. He should have never been starved, chained, and brutalized. He should have never lost his wife, his daughters, his brother. And yet, here he is, a survivor of the worst of humanity, asking the world to save those still trapped in that nightmare. I ask you to take a moment and reflect as we speak here today. There are 59 Elish Sharabis underground, desperate for freedom. Imagine their faces. Imagine their screams and their cries. Imagine what they would say to you today. Will you listen or will you look away? Because this moment will not be forgotten. There is no neutrality here. There is no middle ground. There is only right or wrong. We will never stop fighting for the hostages. We will never abandon them. We will never sit idly by as terrorists hold our people as trophies. We will bring them home, all of them. I thank you, Madam President.
Madam President, members of the Security Council, thank you for the opportunity to brief the Council regarding the humanitarian situation faced by the remaining hostages in Gaza. I would like at the outset to recognize Mr. Elish Sharabi and his unimaginable experience of pain and his remarkable resilience in the face of such immense loss. I extend to him my condolences for the tragic loss of his dear family, wife, 2 daughters, and a brother. I pay him, all hostages, living and deceased, and their families and loved ones, my deepest respect and support. I again extend my deepest condolences to all the bereaved families who lost their family members and loved ones during and after the horrific attack by Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups in Israel on 7 October 2023. The United Nations continue to unequivocally condemn the appalling acts of terror that took place on 7 October and continued holding of hostages in Gaza. Nothing can justify the intentional killing, torture, sexual violence, and destruction, entire families murdered, burned in their homes, taken hostage. The events of that horrific day will not be forgotten. The participation in Security Council meeting of surviving hostages and their heart-wrenching testimonies and many months of agony serve as a stark reminder, but also as a crucial symbol of endurance and hope for those still waiting to see their loved ones back home. Since the attacks, the Secretary General and other senior UN officials have regularly met with the families of hostages and have been deeply moved by their stories and by the torment and anguish they have endured. Madam President, the ceasefire and hostages release deal that took effect on 19 January offered a glimmer of hope and respite by reuniting 25 Israeli hostages with their loved ones and returning the remains of 8 deceased hostages who were killed on 7th of October or while in captivity to their families. Their release and return were sadly also a moment of great anxiety, as most of the living hostages were paraded in front of crowds, and the coffins of the deceased, including those of 2 young children who were killed in captivity, were displayed publicly by Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups during appalling ceremonies that violated international law. The United Nations has repeatedly condemned the parading of coffins containing the bodies of dead Israeli hostages and public displays accompanying the release of living and deceased hostages, including statements made under duress. As of today, at least 59 hostages, alive and deceased, including Eli's brother body, Yossi Sharabi, are still being held captive by Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups. The testimonies of those released provide terrifying accounts of their captivity, including physical and psychological torture, sexual violence and deprivation, indicating that those left behind continue to suffer in horrific conditions, exposed to trauma and suffering since their abduction. The hostages must be released immediately and unconditionally. Until their release, they must be allowed to receive visits and support from the International Committee of the Red Cross, and they must be treated with dignity and respect in line with humanitarian principles. Madam President, the resumption of hostilities on 18th of March adds further despair and uncertainty for those remaining hostages, their families, and their loved ones. This resumption of hostilities amidst significant Israeli airstrikes in Gaza has also been devastating for the civilian population in the Strip. Hundreds of Palestinians have been killed, including women and children. Since the resumption of hostilities, one United Nations Office for Project Services, UNOPS, staff member has also been killed and several have been injured. Commissioner General of the United Nations Relief and Works Agency Lazzarini also informed that in the past few days, another 5 UNRWA staff have been confirmed killed. I reiterate that civilians must be protected, including personnel. The rights and dignity of all those affected by the conflict, whether in Israel, the occupied Palestinian territory, or elsewhere, must be respected and protected. We call on all parties to uphold their obligations under international humanitarian law and international human rights law. The return to hostilities threatens all civilians in Gaza. I echo the Secretary General's call for the resumption of serious negotiations for the ceasefire to be respected, for unimpeded humanitarian assistance to be re-established, and for the remaining hostages to be released immediately and unconditionally. With every passing day, we move further away from the objective of returning the remaining hostages safely to their homes. This was also very clear from the rescued hostages, Ms. Noah Argamini's remarks to the Council last month, where she told us that every moment under captivity was lived in danger. The resumed hostilities in Gaza, compounded with the lack of access and rapidly deteriorating humanitarian situation, are exposing the remaining hostages to constant danger and life-threatening conditions. As Under-Secretary General Fletcher briefed you earlier this week, a renewed ceasefire is the best way of protecting civilians in Gaza, in the occupied Palestinian territory, and in Israel, releasing hostages and detainees and allowing aid and commercial supplies in. We remain steadfast in our commitment to protecting human rights, defending humanitarian principles, and supporting all efforts that promote peace, stability, and a more hopeful future for all people in the Middle East. We are also convinced that the only path to durable peace will be achieved when Israel and Palestine live side by side in peace and security, in line with international law and relevant UN resolutions, with Jerusalem as the capital of both states. The United Nations stands ready to do all it can to support the parties in reaching that objective, and it will continue to do all it can to support an end to this suffering. Once again, I reiterate the Secretary General's deep concern for this conflict's unbearable impact on the victims and his urgent call for the immediate and unconditional release of the hostages. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you, Madam President. And I want to thank also Assistant Secretary General Chiari for his briefing. The United States commends Elish Sharabi for his courage and for joining us today to provide searing, firsthand testimony to the depravity of Hamas. Thank you, Eli. Eli, I offer you our sincere condolences on the unspeakable loss you have suffered of your wife, Lian, and daughters, Noya and Yahel, as well as your brother, Yossi. May their memories be a blessing. The United States condemns Hamas in the strongest terms for these heinous murders. Your presence here in the face of the tragedy you have experienced is moving. Your brave testimony here is one of too many stories. On October 7th, 2023, Hamas brutally massacred almost 1,200 people and took over 250 hostages. The terrorist organization indiscriminately murdered infants and grandparents, partygoers, and Holocaust survivors. President Trump has been clear. Hamas must release all hostages immediately, or there will be hell to pay. 5 Americans still need to come home. Idan Alexander can still return to his parents' arms, but Hamas continues to hold the bodies of Itay Chen, Gadi Haggai, Judy Weinstein Haggai, and Omer Nutra, all brutally murdered in Hamas captivity. Another 54 are held in Hamas tunnels and must be released immediately. Hamas bears sole responsibility for the war and the resumption of hostilities. Fighting could end tomorrow if Hamas released hostages and laid down its arms. As Secretary Marco Rubio put it, this is an outrage. The pillars of America's approach remain resolute. Stand with Israel, stand for peace. Madam President, Hamas has refused all attempts to extend the ceasefire in recent weeks, including a bridge proposal that would have provided calm beyond Ramadan and Passover and allowed time to negotiate a framework for a permanent ceasefire. Madam President and colleagues, it has now been 530 days since Hamas started this horrific conflict, one that has upended so many lives and caused such immense suffering. We must recognize Hamas's savagery for what it is, the acts of a terrorist organization that purposefully committed the worst massacre of Jews since the Holocaust. It was Hamas that engaged in sexual violence toward hostages, released multiple hostages in a condition reminiscent of Holocaust survivors, and murdered and paraded the coffins of the Bibas children through the streets. And it is Hamas who is responsible for the resumption of hostilities, refusing time and time again to accept proposals to extend the ceasefire. We recognize Egypt and Qatar's interest in mediating negotiations, and we look forward to continued discussions with Arab partners on the future of Gaza without Hamas. Hamas is an impediment to peace and has no right to speak on behalf of Palestinians. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United States for the statement. I will give the floor now to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. And thank you, ASG Chiari, for your briefing. The United Kingdom joined the US and France in calling for this important briefing. I would like to add my sincere gratitude to you, Ellie, for the courage you've shown today and every day since those horrific events of 7 October. The suffering you and your family have endured is beyond the imagination. Hamas must be held accountable for their despicable actions, including the murder of your wife, Leanne, a British national, and your 2 daughters. Your powerful testimony also serves as a reminder of the anguish that the remaining hostages held by Hamas continue to endure. This Council has called for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages in all 4 of our resolutions since October 7. I repeat that call today. This includes the release of hostage of Natan Orr and the return of deceased hostages Shay Levinson and Ellie's brother Yossi Sharabi, who also have strong links to the UK. We also remain deeply concerned by the appalling treatment of hostages during their captivity, as we have heard from Ellie today, and the shocking images we have seen around their release. In its dedicated reports, the UN has concluded that there were reasonable grounds to suspect sexual violence occurred during the 7th October attacks. President, the UK is also deeply concerned at reports of sexual and gender-based violence against Palestinian detainees by Israeli forces. These allegations must be fully investigated. We reiterate our call for the International Committee of the Red Cross to be granted unfettered and immediate access to the hostages in Gaza and Palestinian detainees. Granting ICRC access is a clear obligation under international humanitarian law. The suffering in Gaza has gone on for far too long. Just yesterday, we heard the tragic news that a UN compound in Deir al-Balah was hit, killing and injuring humanitarian workers, including a British national. Our thoughts are with the victims and their families. And as my Foreign Secretary has said, this appalling incident must be investigated transparently and those responsible held to account. The protection of the UN and humanitarian workers is non-negotiable. And Israel must facilitate a rapid and unhindered resurgence in the flow of aid. We condemn the unacceptable statements from Defence Minister Katz warning of the total destruction of Gaza. President, both Israel and Hamas agreed to a ceasefire deal in January, which provided for the release of all hostages through the 3 phases of the deal. With the Israeli airstrikes this week, which have killed so many Palestinian civilians, that deal has fallen apart. And with it, the best chance we had seen to return the hostages to their families and end the suffering. We call on the parties to urgently return to this deal, for the sake of the hostages and their families who continue to wait in agony for news of their loved ones, and for the sake of the Palestinians in Gaza, who have already suffered terribly. Diplomacy must be the way forward, not bloodshed. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of France.
Merci, Madame.
Thank you, Madam President. I wish to thank the Assistant Secretary General for his briefing, and I thank Mr. Elish Sharabi for his testimony, his moving testimony indeed. In Geneva, in my previous post, I had the sad privilege of often meeting the families and loved ones of hostages, and I did so to convey France's solidarity to them, as well as France's resolve to assist in the release of all hostages. Mr. Sharabi, please allow me to convey to you my solidarity and my respect for you on behalf of my country. Please accept our deepest condolences following the losses that you have weathered, the losses of your loved ones. Please know that our solidarity is even stronger given that French people have also been detained. Some have come back and some will never return. Madam President, we will never forget the trauma weathered by hostages, their families and the Israeli people during the terrorist attacks perpetrated by Hamas and other terrorist groups on the 7th of October 2023. These were attacks that stand as the worst anti-Semitic massacre since the Holocaust. The Council must condemn these massacres, speaking out with one voice. We will continue to strive tirelessly for the release of all hostages. We decry the hellish ordeal that they have experienced and continue to weather. They are innocent civilians. They have been used by Hamas with a cruelty and with a cynicism which beggars belief. They have been detained in captivity in inhumane conditions and have weathered acts of torture which are acts of heinous crime. All humanitarian law must be respected. The dignity of the human person must be respected, as must the right of hostages to receive visits by the ICRC. All hostages must be released. That is an absolute priority. They must be released in dignity and unconditionally. Hamas must put an end to the degrading and humiliating treatment inflicted upon hostages. The fact these releases are made into a spectacle, in addition to the trauma they've already undergone, recalls the darkest hours of our history. France recalls its solidarity, its unwavering solidarity with the hostages, the families and their loved ones. Madam President, we recognise Israel's right to protect its residents, the duty of Israel to guarantee the protection of its country and its people. We recognise Israel's right to defend itself. We condemn once again the recent rocket fire of Hamas against Israel, and we condemn unequivocally Hamas's use of torture and violence. Blind violence indeed. However, will inflicting new suffering on the Palestinian people make Israel safer? The resumption of Israel's bombing to ensure the release of hostages is not the solution. On the contrary, and France condemns those actions. The humanitarian blockade once again imposed by the Israeli authorities in Gaza must cease. Moreover, France condemns the attack on a United Nations building in the Gaza Strip on the 19th of March, which killed a UNEPS employee and gravely wounded several others. We convey our condolences to the loved ones of the victim and to the United Nations, and we wish a speedy recovery to those wounded. Full clarity must be garnered regarding who is responsible for that very serious incident. The protection of humanitarian personnel must be guaranteed. Elsewhere, we call upon the parties to return to the path opened by the January agreement, the unconditional release of all hostages in dignity, the immediate resumption of the flow of humanitarian aid, a ceasefire, the launching of peace negotiations. We extend our full support to the US efforts, the efforts of Egypt and Qatar, to ensure that all return to the path by the ceasefire. Only a comprehensive political solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict will allow both peoples to live side by side in peace and security. It's in that spirit that with Saudi Arabia we are preparing for an international conference in June for the implementation of the two-state solution. It will be held here in New York. I thank you.
I thank the representative of France for the statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Somalia.
Madam President, thanks for giving me the floor. I begin by expressing our sincere appreciation to ASG Chiari for his briefings on this latest development.
And I give the floor now to the representative of Algeria.
Thank you, Madam President. At the outset, I would like to thank ASG Khaled Chiari for his briefing. We also listened carefully to the representative of the civil society. Consistent with the universal human rights, no civilian, irrespective of their background, should endure suffering. Every innocent life matters. Consistency is a fundamental principle in international relations. A selective, cherry-picking attitude toward international law particularly international humanitarian law, is not acceptable. For a country to uphold its international obligations and contribute positively to global stability, it must obey the legal frameworks that govern human rights and humanitarian activities. Algeria, as a serious member of the international community, firmly respects and upholds all its international obligations. We firmly believe that the law is the cornerstone of international law. Without adherence to international law, we risk descending into a jungle where might make right and injustice prevails. Regrettably, this is precisely what we witness today. In the occupied Palestinian territories, what we see unfolding before us is not the rule of law, but rather an environment where no rules are respected and basic human dignity is disregarded. Humanitarian access, you can block it. Children, women, and elderly, you can massacre them. And workers, UN staff, journalists, and medical staff, you can target and kill them. These are the new rules that have been established in Gaza. Madam President, since October the 7th, members of this Council have constantly adopted resolutions calling for the release of all hostages. We have easily reached agreement on this matter, but we have failed to achieve one crucial call: the immediate and permanent ceasefire. Today, this is the cause of the suffering endured by all people in Gaza. The failure to impose this essential measure prolonged the pain and devastation in Gaza, the pain on all sides. Madam President, international humanitarian and human rights law guarantees the rights of individuals in captivity, ensuring their dignity and human treatment. Moreover, the principle of non-reciprocity, a cornerstone of international humanitarian law, prohibits revenge or retaliation. Even during times of conflict, the protection of human dignity must remain a priority. Suffering cannot justify another suffering. However, it is with great regret that we observe the Israeli occupying powers' blatant disregard for these fundamental principles. To illustrate this, first, over 9,500 Palestinians are currently detained in Israeli prisons, with more than 3,400 held under administrative detention, without charges or trial. Why are these individuals arrested? What legal ground justify their detention? Second, since October 7th, the Israeli occupying authorities have cut off all cooperation with the ICRC, rendering detainees disappeared. Third, one of the most grotesque violations involves the Israeli practice of holding the bodies of dead Palestinians. Before October 7th, the number of such bodies was estimated at approximately 400, some dating back as far as the 80s.
Today, the number exceeds 600. Madam President, the international community must come together to ensure full compliance with international law. Double standards and selective enforcement of these principles are unacceptable. The law must be upheld universally, without exception, to protect the rights of all individuals, regardless of their nationality or the conflict they find themselves in. Only by holding all parties to the same legal standards can we hope to bring an end to the suffering and build a just and lasting peace. I thank you.
And I give the floor now to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Thank you, Madam President. We'd like to thank the ASG, Mr. Khaled Khiari, for his substantive briefing about the situation surrounding the hostages detained in the Gaza Strip. Our hearts were filled with sorrow as we listened to the tragic story of Mr. Elish Sharabi, who lost his entire family. Such brutality can have no justification. We express to you, Mr. Sharabi, our heartfelt condolences. We also grieve over all those who died as a result of the escalation which has been going on for over 18 months now. This endless, vicious cycle of violence needs to end at last. The unbearable suffering of peaceable civilians in the area of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict leave no one indifferent. For that very reason, on the 19th of January, the international community welcomed the establishment of a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. This not only stopped the spiral of violence which claimed the lives of over 49,000 people, but also resulted in the long-awaited release of hostages held in Gaza and of Palestinians held in Israeli prisons. During phase 1 of the deal, 25 hostages were handed over to Israel, as well as 8 bodies, in exchange for almost 1,800 Palestinian detainees. Also, during the 40-day truce, Gazans and Israelis still held hostage there began to harbor hopes of salvation. Access to the enclave was unblocked, humanitarian activities were ramped up, and UN entities reported that humanitarian deliveries to the enclave were increased. The world breathed a sigh of relief. And yet, as the end of phase 1 drew closer, the prospects of further implementation of the deal were called into question. Since day 1 of the truce, the Israeli leadership consistently stepped up its bellicose rhetoric while maintaining an IDF presence in the Strip. The switch to phase 2 of the deal, entailing a permanent ceasefire and the release of all remaining hostages in Gaza, is not even something the Israeli leadership entertained. Instead, the Israeli authorities, despite the deal reached thanks to the mediators, have stubbornly been promoting the idea of a purely technical extension of the ceasefire so as to secure the return of all hostages. For a long time, the situation was up in the air. Yet the window of opportunity to restart a comprehensive peaceful settlement process was slammed shut on the 18th of March, when the IDF resumed airstrikes on the Strip. As a result, over 420 people died, including a UNOPS staffer. 5 more UN personnel were wounded. As the UNSG stated, the death toll since the 7th of October 2023, that is, among UN staff, is at least 280 people. We join our voice to the decisive condemnation by the Secretary-General of attacks on UN staff and his call for a full investigation into this incident. Madam President, we deeply regret the resumption by Israel of military operations in the Gaza Strip. And, as far as we can tell, what we're talking about here is not just airstrikes, but also a ground operation. We decisively condemn any actions leading to the deaths of civilians and the further destruction of social infrastructure. We are particularly disheartened by reports about indiscriminate attacks waged by the Israeli Air Force on Mawasi, an area which
Israel had previously designated as a humanitarian safe zone where all those needing emergency medical care could be evacuated to. As a result, today we heard about Israeli cities being shelled from Gaza, including Tel Aviv. This was predictable, given that violence breeds violence. In parallel, Israel resumed a full-blown blockade on the Strip, stopping supplies of water and electricity, despite this obviously posing a threat to the life and safety of all those who remain there, including Israeli hostages. Such a decision is a particularly flagrant violation of international humanitarian law and can be characterized as a war crime. The issue of survival, which Palestinians are being confronted with, is complicated by the critical situation facing UNRWA operations, UNRWA being a key entity for comprehensive support being provided to the Palestinians. By tightening the screws in the Gaza Strip, the Israeli leadership is simultaneously taking illegal steps, including the military operation in the West Bank. Tomorrow, we will have an opportunity to discuss this topic in greater detail. Madam President, today we were acutely disappointed to see that the ceasefire, which we had all worked towards for so long, turned out to be unsustainable. It's hard to discuss its future prospects when the Israeli military and political leadership is openly announcing its intent to use mounting force against Hamas and to hold future deal negotiations exclusively under fire. It would appear that they've already made the choice in favor of war. Who knows how many new victims await Palestine and Israel in the future? We believe that the fragility of the agreements which Israel has just flouted is also explained by the fact that the Security Council, since the very beginning, the Council knew very little about the details of the negotiations paving the way for the deal. Since the outset, the Security Council was deliberately cut off from this process, and the entire emphasis was placed on other intermediaries. Hence, the entire specialized UN toolkit wasn't needed, although the use of this toolkit could have made the ceasefire sustainable. It's important for those who are going to be working on the restoration of the ceasefire in the Strip to be cognizant of this fact. Despite the new escalation of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, we stand convinced that a diplomatic solution is not only possible, but that is the only realistic option. We call on the Israeli and Palestinian parties, with assistance of intermediaries, to go back to the negotiations table to craft a mutually acceptable compromise solution to the issue of detained persons, a return to the ceasefire, and a resumption of comprehensive humanitarian access. This could allow for a sustainable normalization in the Gaza Strip and for the kickstarting of a full-scale reconstruction of the enclave. We stand convinced that this is precisely what peaceable Palestinians, as well as the relatives and loved ones of hostages that remain in Gaza, wish for, including Mr. Maxim Herkin, who was born in the Donbass. It's important for all regional players and the international community as a whole to work towards this end. The process of Israeli-Palestinian settlement should return to the political track so as to satisfy all of Israel's lawful security concerns, as well as Palestinians' aspirations to their own state within 1967 borders. We stand ready to pursue this objective here in the Security Council, together with all those who share in this approach. I thank you.
Having listened to some of the statements made by others around the Council, on 3 points, if I may. On humanitarian aid, getting into Gaza, I would just reiterate the position that we have articulated, that nobody wants to see Palestinian civilians in Gaza go hungry or thirsty, and that we are working tirelessly to resolve this crisis. With respect to the report issued by the Commission of Inquiry cited by some in the Council today on alleged sexual violence by the IDF, I would point out that this report conflates the acts of a few who will be reprimanded by Israel with the full-fledged sexual violence campaign orchestrated by Hamas on October 7th, and that is disgraceful. With respect to the allegation that Israel is engaging in indiscriminate strikes, the United States would remind Council members that Israel is targeting Hamas leaders and operatives who continue to use civilian infrastructure and hide among the civilian population. And the Council must condemn this practice. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United States for the statement. I now give the floor to the permanent